often come into therapy hoping for a simple fix to their relationship problems. They want a tip, a phrase, a magic trick that will make someone love them more or make the pain of not being loved less. And over the years, especially when it comes to dating, I've heard this idea tossed around a lot. If you pull away, they'll want you more. It's become this kind of pop psychology cliche, the idea that detachment creates desire, that women especially are drawn to men who don't chase, that if you act like you don't care, they'll come running. And sure, on the surface, that might look true, sometimes, but what's really going on beneath that? Because it's not about playing games. Not really. What people are actually responding to. What women are often drawn to when a man seems detached isn't the coldness or distance. It's the sense of self, the calm, the groundedness, the feeling that this person isn't anxiously reaching out to be chosen, but is already choosing himself. When someone is rooted in who they are, when they're not desperate for approval, not bending or performing or chasing, it sends a very clear message. I know my value, whether or not you see it. And that's magnetic. I once had a client, James, who couldn't understand why women lost interest so quickly. He was kind, smart, successful, emotionally available, but he was also eager. He would text back immediately, rearrange his schedule, check in constantly, not because he was manipulative, but because he was anxious. He needed constant reassurance that things were okay. And that energy, that emotional neediness, became heavy, not because he was a bad person, but because he hadn't yet learned how to be okay with uncertainty, how to hold space for his own feelings without spilling them onto someone else. Then one day, after yet another relationship fizzled out, he said to me, I think I need to just stop caring. But I told him, no, you don't need to stop caring. You need to care differently, because detachment, the kind that's actually attractive, isn't about shutting down or playing hard to get. It's about being connected to yourself more than you're connected to someone else's opinion of you. It's about staying open-hearted but not emotionally dependent. When a man is at ease in his own company, when he can tolerate silence, when he doesn't need someone else to regulate his self-worth, that's the kind of detachment that feels strong, not distant. And women feel that. Not because he's withholding, but because he's whole. We confuse neediness with intimacy all the time. But true intimacy doesn't come from clinging. It comes from two whole people choosing to come closer, not because they need someone to complete them, but because they want to share what they've already built within themselves. The irony is, once James started investing in his own life again, his friendships, his creativity, his sense of purpose, women didn't drift away. They leaned in because now there was something real there, not a performance, not a strategy, but a person. So yes, women and people in general are drawn to men who detach, but only when that detachment isn't coldness, when it's rooted in calm, in clarity, in confidence without arrogance, presence without pressure. Because the real secret isn't detachment, it's self-possession, the quiet power of someone who no longer begs to be chosen because they've already chosen themselves. I can't tell you how many times I've sat across from someone who says, usually with a mix of frustration and quiet exhaustion, I've tried everything. I didn't text back right away. I acted like I didn't care. I gave her space. Isn't that what women want? And then they pause, confused and disappointed when none of it worked the way they hoped it would. And then they pause, confused and disappointed when none of it worked the way they hoped it would. And then they pause, confused and disappointed when none of it worked the way they hoped it would. And so I ask, gently, why did you do all those things? And the answer is almost always the same. to get her to like me more. That's the part people misunderstand. Detachment, real, healthy detachment, isn't a tactic. It's not a manipulation tool or a strategy to win someone over. It's not pretending to be uninterested so you can look cool or mysterious. That's not detachment. That's insecurity in disguise. Real detachment doesn't come from a place of trying to create a reaction in someone else. It comes from a place of calm within yourself. It's the difference between silence that's rooted in fear, if I say how I feel, she'll leave, and silence that's rooted in strength. I know who I am, and I don't need to prove my worth. One is controlling, the other is self-respecting. I had a client, let's call him Adam, who had been caught in this cycle for years. He would meet someone, get really excited, and then try to play it cool. He would overanalyze every text, hold back emotions, and constantly second-guess himself. He thought this was what detachment looked like, keeping his cards close, staying distant, not showing too much. But he wasn't being calm. He was being anxious. And the anxiety showed up in his body language, his energy, the way he was always waiting for her response, like it held the answer to his self-worth. What he learned eventually was that true detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care honestly, without needing a specific outcome. You can like someone and still let things unfold naturally. You can be interested and not obsessed. You can show up without demanding that the other person meet you exactly where you are every second of the way. It's not about withdrawing emotionally. It's about holding your emotional center even when someone else hasn't decided yet if they want to be in your life. That's hard. Especially if you grew up believing that love is earned through effort or that your worth is based on how someone responds to you. But if you can shift that, if you can start to see detachment not as a performance, but as a kind of emotional maturity, everything changes. Because people, especially women, are incredibly intuitive. They can feel when you're being authentic and when you're using distance as a way to hook them in. They might not always be able to name it, but they feel the difference. And most of the time, what they pull away from isn't closeness. It's the neediness behind the mask of detachment. So if you're going to detach, make sure it's not about trying to get something from someone. Make sure it's not about controlling the situation. Detach because you've already chosen yourself, because you've built a life that feels meaningful with or without someone else's validation. Detach not to get love, but because you already know that love, in its healthiest form, can't be forced or tricked or earned through silence and games. That's what makes real detachment powerful. It doesn't chase, it doesn't beg, and it doesn't manipulate. It simply stays true to who you are, what you want, and how you show up. And in a world full of pretense and strategy, that kind of emotional honesty is magnetic. A lot of people think the key to attracting someone is to be impressive, be the funniest, the most attentive, the best listener, the one who always knows the right thing to say. And those things can help, but they're not what truly creates that feeling of pull, that magnetism you can't quite explain. That pull doesn't come from performance. It comes from something quieter, something harder to define. Emotional self-sufficiency. It's that unspoken sense that this person knows who they are, that they're comfortable in their own skin, that they can sit with their feelings without needing someone else to constantly soothe or fill them up. There's a kind of safety in that energy. Not the kind that says, I'll never hurt you, but the kind that says, I know how to take care of myself, and I won't make you responsible for that. I had a client once, let's call him Derek, who couldn't figure out why his relationships always started off strong and then unraveled within a few months. He was warm, successful, and genuinely wanted to build something meaningful. But when we peeled back the layers, it became clear that underneath all his charm was a constant, low-grade fear of abandonment. The moment he liked someone, he needed to know, are you all in? Do you feel the same way? Can I trust that you won't leave? So even when things were going well, he was scanning for signs of disinterest. He'd overthink a delayed reply. He'd replay conversations in his head. He'd subtly try to manage the other person's emotions, sending reassuring texts, planning thoughtful dates, checking in a little too often. On the surface, it looked like attentiveness, but underneath, it was anxiety. And that anxiety made the relationship feel heavy before it had a chance to breathe. What Derek didn't realize was that emotional self-sufficiency doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you never get hurt or that you don't need people. It means you can hold your own emotions without needing someone else to fix them. You can love someone deeply without collapsing if they don't love you back the exact same way, at the exact same time. That kind of emotional steadiness is incredibly attractive, not because it's flashy, but because it makes the other person feel free. Free to be themselves, free to take a breath, free to move toward you without feeling like they're being pulled too hard. When you're emotionally self-sufficient, you bring your whole self into a relationship. Not just the parts that are easy to love, but the ones that are real. And you invite the other person to do the same. There's no scrambling to win approval, no shrinking to avoid conflict, no micromanaging their feelings so you can feel okay. You're not waiting for them to complete you. You're inviting them to meet you. That's what creates real intimacy. Not dependency, not performance, just two people who can stand on their own, choosing to walk alongside each other. And that choice feels more powerful when you know it's coming from a place of wholeness, not from fear or need. So when people say they're drawn to someone who seems calm, confident, a little bit mysterious, it's usually not mystery at all. It's just the quiet confidence of someone who isn't trying to be chosen, someone who's already chosen themselves. And ironically, the moment you stop trying so hard to be wanted, the more people want to be around you. So the second thing that we need is for people to understand what we choose to be. So when people say they're drawn to someone who seems calm, confident, a little bit mysterious, it's usually not mystery at all. It's just the quiet confidence of someone who isn't trying to be chosen. So when people say they're drawn to someone who seems calm, confident, a little bit mysterious, it's usually not mystery at all. It's just not because you're distant, but because you're whole. And that energy, even if you never say a word about it, speaks volumes. I think we underestimate how much anxiety shapes our relationships. Not the obvious kind that shows up as panic or meltdown, but the quieter kind. The kind that lives in the silence after someone doesn't text back right away. The kind that spirals when we're trying to decide whether to reach out again or wait. The kind that convinces us we've said too much or not enough. That subtle buzz beneath the surface of wanting someone and being terrified they might not want us back. And here's where things get complicated. Because that anxiety, it doesn't make us more lovable. It makes us more reactive, more controlling, even if it comes from a good place, more inclined to perform or overgive or walk on eggshells. And ironically, all of those things, though they come from a craving for closeness, tend to push people further away. Desire doesn't thrive in that space. It doesn't grow where there's pressure or where one person feels like they're being asked to carry the weight of someone else's emotional regulation. It grows in space where both people feel free, where attraction can breathe, rather than suffocate under the weight of expectations or unspoken need. I remember a client, let's call him Lucas, who was always trying to manage the relationship he was in. He didn't realize he was doing it at first. He just thought he was being thoughtful. He'd check in constantly, always ask what she needed, always try to be 2 steps ahead of any possible conflict. He was hyper aware of her moods, her tone, her schedule. And while his intention was to be caring, what it started to feel like to his partner was emotional micromanagement. Yeah. It's hard to be angry or sad or hurt or emotional or sad or hurt or emotional or sad or hurt or emotional or sad. What he was really doing was keeping track of how the partner responded, and based on their response, he was headed. She began pulling back. He responded by trying harder, more effort, more attentiveness, more reassurances. But all of it came from a place of fear, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear that if he didn't do everything right, he'd lose her. And that's the thing. When anxiety drives our behavior, we start to confuse intensity with connection. But desire doesn't work that way. It doesn't want to be chased endlessly or tended to like a crisis. It wants ease. It wants presence. It wants to feel chosen, not out of obligation or fear, but out of true mutual want. When Lucas began to slow down, to sit with his anxiety instead of acting on it, to trust that he didn't have to prove himself every minute of the day, something shifted. Not overnight, but gradually, he began to reconnect with his own center, rather than trying to center everything around her. And once he stopped trying to manage the relationship like a fragile object, his partner began to lean in again. Because that's what happens when the anxiety quiets down. There's room for playfulness, room for wonder, room for genuine desire to surface, not because it's being chased or demanded, but because it feels safe enough to emerge. We don't always realize that anxiety is a kind of noise. It drowns out the subtler, more nuanced signals of connection. It can make us look at the other person constantly, but forget to look at ourselves. And when we get quiet enough to hear what's underneath it, when we stop trying to control the outcome and instead allow the relationship to unfold, that's when we can really see each other. Desire isn't a reaction to pressure. It's a response to freedom, to feeling like you're wanted, not needed, to knowing the person in front of you is here because they choose to be, not because you've held them there with your anxiety, but because they feel something real in your presence. And once you can hold your own discomfort without asking someone else to fix it, that's where connection deepens. That's where desire begins again. There's a kind of person you meet who doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. They don't dominate the room. They don't chase. They don't prove. But you feel them. You're drawn to them. Not because they're loud or flashy, but because there's a calm, steady gravity to the way they exist in the world. That's self-possession. And it's one of the most quietly powerful things a person can bring into a relationship. Not just in romance, but in friendship, in family, in how we move through life. It's the difference between I hope you like me and I know who I am. And that difference changes everything. I remember a session with a client named Jordan. He had just gotten out of a relationship that, in his words, felt like I was constantly trying to convince her I was good enough. He told me how he would overthink every message he sent, how he'd replay conversations in his head, how he was always trying to guess what she wanted and mold himself to be that. He was exhausted, not just from the relationship, but from abandoning himself so often in the hope of being accepted. And when it ended, he didn't just feel heartbroken, he felt lost, like he didn't even know who he was without someone else's reflection to define him. That's the danger of neediness. Not the human kind. We all need connection. We all need love. But the kind that says, I don't know my worth unless you tell me what it is. The kind that makes us shapeshift, perform, overextend, hoping the right amount of effort will finally earn us the love we crave. Self-possession is the opposite of that. It's not arrogance. It's not about being emotionally unavailable or detached. It's about being rooted. It's saying, this is who I am. These are my values. This is how I love and how I want to be loved in return. It's knowing that if someone walks away, you'll grieve, yes, but you won't unravel because you weren't leaning your entire sense of identity against someone else's opinion of you. There's nothing more attractive than someone who doesn't chase validation, who doesn't need you to fill their empty spaces because they've already done the work of knowing themselves. That kind of energy creates space, not pressure, for connection to happen. And here's the truth. People feel that. They feel when your interest comes from curiosity instead of desperation. They feel when your attention is a gift, not a plea. And they respond differently. There's more ease, more respect, more room for something mutual to unfold. Jordan eventually began to rebuild not just his confidence, but his connection to himself. He started making decisions based on what felt aligned, rather than what felt safe. He let go of relationships that made him feel small, even if they felt familiar. And slowly, something shifted. He stopped asking, how can I be what they want? And started asking, do they align with the life I'm building? And that shift, that's where real power comes from. Not from control, not from charm, but from clarity. When you're self-possessed, you don't just attract different people, you attract different dynamics. Healthier ones, more honest ones. Because you're not trying to be chosen anymore. You're actually choosing your own moral code, your own values, your own habits, your own happiness, your own self-possession. You don't have to change them. You attract the right people. You attract the right people. You attract the right people. Because you're not trying to be chosen, you're not trying to be chosen. You're trying to be healthy. You're trying to live in a state of being within. You end up seen, you're choosing from a place of fullness, not fear. That's what makes someone truly magnetic. Not the chase, not the charm, but the quiet, steady energy of a person who's already home within themselves and is simply inviting you in if you're meant to be there too. There's a moment in almost every long-term relationship, sometimes early, sometimes years in, when one person starts to feel like they're losing the other. Maybe it's subtle at first, a little less eye contact, a little more distance, an emotional temperature that's just cooler. And the instinct, especially when you love someone, is to grip tighter, to talk more, text more, apologize faster, be more available, as if by shrinking the space between you, you can stop them from drifting. But intimacy, real intimacy, doesn't grow in that kind of grasping. It doesn't come from trying to hold on so tightly that there's no room left to breathe. It comes from the space where two whole people can stand beside each other, not leaning in to fill a void, but showing up because they want to be seen as they are. One of my clients, Rachel, once said in session, I don't know how to feel close to him without constantly needing him. She had been in a relationship for almost 2 years, and what started as this deep, passionate connection had slowly turned into anxiety. Every time he pulled back, even a little, got quiet, canceled a plan, didn't respond right away, she spiraled. She tried harder, she gave more, and every time it seemed to push him further away. What she didn't realize was that she had confused closeness with dependency. She thought intimacy meant always being available, always being connected, always knowing where the other person stood. But that's not closeness. That's enmeshment. And when someone starts to feel like they can't move freely within the relationship without causing panic or guilt, they start to retreat, not because they don't care, but because they need air. What Rachel really longed for wasn't more access to her partner, it was more access to herself. She had made the relationship the container for her sense of worth, her sense of calm, her sense of identity. So when it wobbled, she did too. But relationships are not built to carry the entire weight of our emotional world. That's too much pressure for anyone, no matter how much they love you. That kind of intensity feels romantic in theory, but in practice, it's exhausting and fragile, because the moment something shifts, everything falls apart. It wasn't until Rachel began building her own life again, reconnecting with old friends, starting therapy, spending time alone, without the goal of being productive or distracting herself, that she began to feel grounded. And once she felt more whole, the panic began to fade. She could love without clinging, want without needing, be vulnerable without collapsing if the other person didn't respond exactly how she hoped. And from that space, her partner began to come closer, not because she pulled him, but because the relationship finally felt safe again. Not in the suffocating way, but in the freeing way. The way where you know you're wanted but not required to rescue. The way where love feels like a choice, not a job. We grow up with stories that tell us love means never letting go, always holding tight, being each other's everything. But the healthiest love doesn't want to be everything. It wants to be real. And reality means two people who are whole on their own, choosing to build something together, not from a place of desperation, but from a place of desire. Because intimacy doesn't come from how tightly you can hold someone. It comes from how honestly you can show up. And the more whole you are within yourself, the more space you create for a connection that's not just deep, but lasting.